The concept of modernity coloniality was first introduced by Aníbal Quijano and later expanded by Walter Mignolo. This concept highlights the inseparable connection between two ideas, modernity and coloniality. Many post-colonial thinkers, those advocating for decolonial perspectives, aim to emphasize the link between colonialism and the narrative of modernity, which has shaped how we understand much of the world's history. They see modernity not just as a historical period, but as an epistemological framework deeply tied to the European colonial project. Decolonialists want to move away from the critiques that focus on geography when addressing Eurocentrism. Instead, they propose an epistemic view of coloniality. This means recognizing that epistemic dominance is not confined to specific places. There is a history of knowledge based harm in every region, even in the West. Even critical work originating from the heartlands of old empires cannot escape the logic of coloniality if it operates within the rhetoric of modernity. Quijano talks about two important concepts, Euro-centered colonialism and Western imperialism. Euro-centered colonialism refers to direct domination by Europeans over conquered territories across the globe. It is a formal system where the West controls others politically, socially, and culturally. On the other hand, Western imperialism is more about social interests linked with unequal power among countries. It is not an external imposition but an association of powerful groups. Both of these systems create structures of power that result in social discrimination based on race, ethnicity, nationality, and culture. These social categories are given an objective, rational, and scientific status, becoming deeply ingrained in our minds. Quijano points out that even when direct colonialism is absent, the relationship between European or Western culture and others still reflects a form of ongoing colonial domination. Colonialism involves taking away knowledge from the colonized people, especially in fields like mining, agriculture, and engineering. The colonizers then imposed their own ways of expressing, believing, and thinking, including images and symbols. They specifically aimed to create a distorted image of how they produced knowledge and meaning. How did they achieve this? Quijano explains that first, the colonizers made sure their knowledge was kept away from the colonized. Then, they selectively taught some parts of their knowledge. Finally, they made their culture appealing by linking power. European culture became a standard that other societies aspired to emulate. European culture was considered a universal model, leaving its influence visible worldwide today. However, the impact varied in different planes. In Asia and the Middle East, the influence was less, and their strong cultures could not be entirely erased. In Africa, cultural destruction was significant, but the Europeans could not completely eliminate the native culture. In the Americas, colonial cultural repression was massive. It involved the widespread extermination of native populations through violent conquest and diseases brought by the Europeans. Latin America stands out as the most extreme case of European cultural colonization. The term coloniality of power refers to the practices and influences of European cultural colonization on present day societies. It maintains race as a crucial part of how colonized and colonizers are socially classified. Initially, new identities were formed based on race, such as whites, blacks, Indians, Negroes, yellows, etc. From these, new geocultural identities emerged, like Europeans, Americans, Asians, Africans, etc. This racial social stratification contributing to the coloniality of power, continues to shape and influence the Euro-centered capitalist colonial modern world. It also affects job categories, creating distinctions like white-collar jobs primarily for Europeans and blue-collar jobs for others. As colonial domination strengthened, there was a simultaneous effort to establish the world cultural complex known as European modernity, rationality. This European perspective became the universal paradigm of knowledge and how humanity relates to the rest of the world. To understand this, we need to understand the European concept of knowledge. European concept of knowledge was rational, seen as a product of the relationship between a subject, an isolated individual, and an object, something external to the subject. This subject-object paradigm led to a division between the subject, considered the bearer of reason, and the object perceived as nature. Individualism, or the idea of isolated individuals, was at the core of European modernity rationality. In this paradigm, the other is seen as an object, not as other subjects contributing to the social totality. This perspective allowed Europeans to omit references to other subjects outside the European context, making the colonial order of totality invisible. The emergence of the idea of the West or Europe was an acknowledgement of identity in relation to the rest of the colonized world. For the European mind, these differences were perceived primarily as inequalities in a hierarchical sense. Only European culture was considered rational, and people from other cultures were viewed as different, unequal, irrational, and inferior, objects of knowledge to be studied and taught. The subject-object perspective extended to various aspects of life, including the development of social sciences like anthropology and ethnography. Cultures were initially treated as objects of study. Quijano goes on to explain how European Western rationality modernity was shaped through the restructuring of power in capitalist and urban social relations, as well as in the colonization of the rest of the world. Colonialism not only otherized people but also presented an organistic image of social totality, treating society as a closed structure with hierarchical rules governing its parts. Imagine if society was seen as a human body, where certain parts were considered more important than others. The brain symbolized the owners of capital, the parties were the head, and the unions were the feet. This hierarchy reflected the ruling party in Europe as the brain of the world, while the rest of the world under colonialism was perceived as carrying the white man's burden. In this perspective, history was thought as an evolutionary journey from primitive to civilized, from tradition to modernity, and from savage to rational. Europe saw itself as the model for the future of all other societies and cultures, an advanced form of the history of the entire human species. Surprisingly, Europe successfully imposed this mirage on the cultures it colonized, and it continues to attract many. Quijano doesn't just criticize this rationality modernity, but suggests decolonization as a way forward. Instead of completely rejecting the European colonial modernity concept of totality, he advocates freeing the production of knowledge from its pitfalls. In non-Western cultures, totality acknowledges the diversity of reality without denying or reducing it hierarchically. Quijano emphasizes the need to critique colonial rationality by severing ties between rationality modernity and coloniality and break free from power not based on free decisions by free people. To achieve epistemological decolonization, Quijano proposes fostering intercultural communication and interchange of experience and meanings. This, in turn, could lead to a different rationality and universality, liberating people to think freely, choose independently, and engage in various cultural configurations. In essence, Quijano presents an intellectual critique of the European colonial project and suggests an alternative path towards decolonizing the cultural landscape.